Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing. Senator McCaskill and I are both here. We probably had as many disasters in Missouri this year as in any year that anybody's aware of. We had the spring flood in the Mississippi that Mr. Massengale mentioned, and still challenges there because of that. The Black River at Poplar Bluff flooded. The Missouri River looks like it'll be in flood stage through the entire state from the Iowa border to St. Louis for all of August, and then a number of tornadoes, including one that hit the St. Louis airport and the area around that, and the tornado that Mr. O'Brien described so well. So we've had lots of FEMA experience and flooding in Branson at Taneycomo at the lake there, and lots of problems. I think that we've tried to deal with those in the best way we could. But Rob, I know you've got to leave. Mr. O'Brien, you've got to leave at 3:30 or so. I'm going to direct a couple at 4 o'clock. Well, maybe good. So we've got second round of questions then, and I'm glad to have that. Just to start with Mr. O'Brien, you've been in the middle of this every day now since the late May. Do you have any recommendations that FEMA and the private sector could individually or collectively, how they'd improve what we do to respond to these disasters?
Well, we have dealt most specifically with the private sector side of FEMA, as mentioned, working on business recovery. And FEMA does not have dollars for businesses, but they do have resources. What I would say, Senator, is while they have been great partners in this, there is perhaps an issue of speed in response. I noted one which I think is a very good example of them working with a national partner. As we sat down and talked, we talked about laptops for small businesses. They brought that national partner in early in the second week, and then said we can expand this to the schools as well, which is terrific. The issue in that is probably in those first 2 weeks is when we had a number of businesses who really needed laptops because their computer systems were in the wreckage at some point in time. Mm-hmm. So here we are at coming up on the 2-month mark, and these laptops are just beginning to arrive. So I think some of that could be addressed, and I know every disaster is different. Every situation is different, but I think on the private sector side of FEMA, if they could work with those national and regional partners and define up front what the resources are, or at least basic resources are, and make those available in a much more rapid fashion, it would benefit the business sector tremendously.
Of the businesses you talked about that are damaged or out of business that are trying to recover, do any of them have? Is there any private sector? I'm not sure what the response is to, like the florist shop that almost exclusively dealt with the hospital that's now essentially not there. Is there a disruption of business? Is there really any way that a business can plan for this kind of thing? And have you got some stories of businesses that have faced challenges that are different than you'd expect?
Well, I think there would be certainly all kinds of stories out there, Senator, in terms of how businesses have responded. I think a key, just in general, that we have found many businesses were not adequately prepared for was the loss of information. We are so computer-driven in this age that unless the records are adequately backed up and preferably off-site, we had businesses that lost their records. Then in looking to the SBA for a loan, they had to retrieve some of those records, and then they found out that their accountant was gone, and oftentimes it was difficult to retrieve those records. Now, we did have good support from the Small Business and Technology Development Center counselors and from the Secretary of State's office and others to help retrieve those records, but that was probably one of the unifying things with many of the businesses.
You know, and just as an aside to that point, the hospital, the 2,500 employee hospital that really is I think, going to have to be totally rebuilt, and maybe we'll even choose to relocate somewhere else in the community. They had just backed up all of their health records at the end of the preceding month. So they were 22 days away from having completed the project, so that everybody who had health records at that hospital still has them, but they were that close to not having them. And it's an interesting point that people lose records. Their accountants lost the records as well. And matter of fact, maybe even if you haven't lost your business, your accountant may have lost. So backing up and access, and thank you, Chairman. It happens that both Joplin and St. Louis are both served by for-profit utility companies. Mr. Womack, I don't know if you were in this position during Katrina or not, but we waived a provision for Mississippi, at least in Katrina, so that any utility company that had replacement costs because of the disaster qualified for the same level of FEMA assistance. And my point on this always is, which was Governor Barbour well explained it at the time, everybody who's served by this particular company pays taxes just like the person pays federal taxes that has a municipal utility or an associated electric co-op utility who automatically qualify for reimbursement. But like the city of Joplin, Mr. O'Brien, is all served by Empire Electric. I don't know if you've had discussions about this or not. I suspect you have. What do you see as the long-term impact on utilities in a community that that their utility provider doesn't automatically, isn't allowed, frankly, we'd have to change the law to allow it, isn't allowed to participate in the cost share for disaster recovery?
Well, Senator, I think you raise a good point with that. In the Mississippi experience, our electric utility is Empire District Electric. It is locally headquartered. It serves approximately 10,000 square miles in 4 states, most of that in southwest Missouri. And certainly, year in and year out, they do anticipate that there will be some level of damaging storms. What they don't necessarily anticipate is an EF5 tornado that cuts through 14 miles of their service area, including some of the most densely populated part of that. And their estimate in terms of the damage done is today somewhere around $25 million. It could go higher as they continue on that. And what that means for our community and frankly for our surrounding neighbors who are served by Empire is, since they do not fit in to the Qualifications Stafford Act, is that eventually there will have to be a rate increase on that. And that is the only means that they have to recover those dollars. And I think the element of that when we think about the long term is that when you have a community like Joplin or any other community that's served by investor-owned utilities that have had catastrophic disasters, you want them to recover. You want them to recover as quickly as they can. And if you place utilities in a position just because they're investor-owned utilities where they eventually have to raise their rates to recoup that, essentially what you're doing is making it harder for the residents, and you're making it harder for the businesses that are still in operation, and you make it more difficult to attract new business investment in the community. And so instead of incenting recovery, you have disincented recovery by not allowing them to take part in that funding.
Mr. Womack, do you remember this situation when it came up in Mississippi?
Senator, I do, but it was not managed through my agency. It was not Stafford Act funding. As you said, it was required a special act to allow the tax dollars to be able to help the for-profit utilities. So I don't have the details on it, but I do know that it was in an effort to try to make sure that the rates for the 2 big providers in Mississippi, Entergy and Mississippi Power, and of course Entergy was heavily invested in Louisiana as well. But I don't know the details on it, but I do know that it occurred.
Mr. Maxwell, have you had any experience with this kind of thing?
We have not.
All right. Mr. Serino, I just say I'm going to continue to work on this. And, Chairman, I'd love to talk to you about it. And Senator McCaskill and I have been talking about it. You know, if this community would have happened to have had a municipal provider, let's say they'd pay 10% under the Stafford Act of the repair cost, they'd be passing along $2.5 million to the ratepayers instead of $25 million. Or if they've got a 75-25 share, they'd be passing along $6 million to the ratepayers instead of $25 million. Those ratepayers pay federal taxes in exactly the same way that the neighboring community of Carthage that has a municipal utility pays federal taxes. We've had, frankly, a little more experience with this with devastating ice storms, where you'd have miles and miles of poles broken off, and the mileage that's in the electric co-op, federal taxpayers come in and say, we're going to help you keep your future rates low. Or if it's in the municipal utility, they say, we're going to help you keep your future rates low. But if it happens to be in a for-profit, we say, you're going to go to the PSC, or whatever you call the commission in any state, and you're going to ask them, and they're going to tell you, yes, we may not give you exactly the time frame, but I think inevitably they let you pass this cost along to the taxpayer, the ratepayer, who just happens to be served by a different kind of utility, I think it's one of the great inequities in the way we look at this particular problem. And I just hope you'll think about it with me too. And I know it's not something you can do right now, but I do think it's an area in the Stafford Act where we really could bring greater equity to neighbors who suffer the same kind of calamity. One of them at the end of the day winds up in their business, or maybe in their business or their home, with a much higher utility rate than the other one did, just because of who provides their utility to them. And it's not that the for-profit absorbs that loss. The for-profit goes to the public service entity, whatever it is, and they inevitably say, sure, you can pass those costs along to, as Mr. O'Brien pointed out, everybody who happens to be served by your utility. In this case, you know, Joplin's a big part of what that utility does provide.